Hello, everyone. This is Rick, and welcome to Astral Club. This is the end of the Anasazi Civilization. Before we get into it, just want to mention Patreon. If you'd like to support the work of this channel, spreading information about astral projection and spirituality, you can do so. You get advanced episodes on Sunday, a library of downloaded episodes for your podcast app, and Patreon email where you can contact me and ask questions, and we can talk back and forth. And if you're interested, there is a link in the description. Next up, private lessons. If you'd like to learn to astral project, be glad to work with you. I've noticed these lessons are very helpful because I can customize the information I have to the hopes, dreams, and fears of the individuals who want to learn to astral project, and they can share some sensitive topics with me and knowing that it's a safe place to do so. If you are interested in information on that, you'll also find an email in the description. I decided to project a few days ago, and sometimes my destinations just come to me out of nowhere. And for some reason, I decided to check up on the decline and fall of the Anasazi Native American culture. Now, I have done a little bit of research now, which I typically do after my experience, because I don't want to prejudice myself by reading perhaps incorrect information and then using that information to interpret what I see perhaps wrongly. I was aware of the Anasazi, as many people are who've watched PBS and similar type programs. And I recall a program, it was a number of years ago, and they were cliff dwellers. I remembered that. And I remembered that it was presented as a sort of egalitarian type civilization. And indeed, when Hollywood shows us native cultures, they tend to look very egalitarian. And I think there's probably some incorrect information being translated there. Once upon a time, we showed Native Americans as extremely violent brutes. And then at some point, we changed over to the other extreme, where suddenly they became these noble beings who were perfect, and the Europeans were completely evil, who just did murderous things to these poor innocent people. As most extremes and beliefs that are extreme, you generally find that the truth is always somewhere in between. Native Americans were humans. They had the same failings and good points as every human. They performed noble sacrifices and created great cultures. They also did a lot of evil things, much like other humans around the world. In short, they were human with all of the failings and the good points that humans have. Now, I'm going to give you the benefit, in case you're not up on it, because I looked it up on Google, the Sacred Temple of Knowledge. And the Anasazi was a civilization that arose as early as 1500 BC. Their descendants are today's Pueblo Indians, such as the Hopi and the Zuni, and they live in about 20 communities along the Rio Grande today in New Mexico and northern Arizona. Now, during the 10th and 11th centuries, Chaco Canyon, which is in western New Mexico, which is where I believe that program was set, where I watched. It was the cultural center of the Anasazi homeland. And it was in an area roughly corresponding to what today is called the Four Corners region, which is parts of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. Before I go on, I just want to mention that Anasazi is translated loosely to something like ancient enemies. And it's believed that it comes from the Navajo, who were enemies, by all accounts, of the Anasazi. And indeed, today the term has fallen out of political correctness. They now have other terms, Pueblo, ancestors, things similar to that. I haven't done a lot of research on that, but I know that it's kind of like the word Eskimo. When Europeans first traveled to meet the peoples of the extreme north, they asked what they were called, and they were told Eskimos. And this was by the southern tribes, what have you, those who were inhabited the areas of Washington, for instance, today, the state of Washington. And it meant eaters of raw flesh. So it was an insult that was used to describe them. So naturally, they didn't describe themselves as that. They described themselves as Inuit, which roughly translates to the people. So it's the same kind of thing with the Anasazi. You know, they were named for today by their enemies. So it's something that happens quite frequently in history. At any rate, they occupied a 30,000 square mile landscape of sandstone canyons, buttes, and mesas, and it was about a 30,000 people population, which was a pretty good size for 1,000 years ago or so in the southwest of what is now the United States. The Anasazi built magnificent villages such as the Chaco Canyon's Pueblo Bonito, which was a 10th century complex that was as many as 5 stories tall and contained about 800 rooms. They also laid 400-mile networks of roads, some of them 30 feet wide, across deserts and canyons. And they were also known as sophisticated astronomers. So they were interesting people from that standpoint. For most of their long time span, they occupied a region now known as the Four Corners. They lived in open or easily accessible sites within canyons. But around 1250, it's estimated that many of the people began constructing settlements high in the cliffs, settlements that offered defense and protection. And these villages were well preserved today by the dry climate which endures in that area of the United States. Now, towards the end of the 13th century, some cataclysmic event forced the Anasazi to flee their homes and head towards the Rio Grande and Little Colorado River. Just exactly what happened, archaeologists aren't certain. Today's Pueblo Indians have oral histories about their people's migration, but the details of these stories remain closely guarded secrets among the Pueblo people. Within the past decade, archaeologists have wrung from these pristine ruins new understandings of why the Anasazi left, and a dark picture emerges, including violence and warfare. After about the year 1200 CE or AD, something very unpleasant happens, says the University of Colorado archaeologist Stephen Leekson. The wheels came off. So let's get into this. When I left my body, I decided to head towards the end of the Anasazi Civilization. And in my head, I was able to clearly picture a cliff-dwelling scene that I had in my mind from that special that I had seen years ago. And that's what I headed for. After a moment of darkness, I became aware that I was hovering over an area that looked like the Southwest, and below me there was cliff dwellings with many holes in the side of the cliff, like some giant animal had burrowed its way into the cliffside. As I descended and got closer, I got a better look at what was going on. And there I saw hundreds and perhaps thousands of people making their way around the area, going up and down ladders, coming out of these caves dug into the cliffside, and people making pottery, cooking, the types of activity you might see in a typical daily village of any type of ancient people or Native Americans. I got closer still, and I guess I was still influenced by Hollywood. I was expecting to see some sort of ideal society, and I was disappointed pretty quickly. I noticed that it wasn't quite as egalitarian as I thought, and then things got darker as I started doing some light scans. There were a good number of well-built men who had on, I guess I could say, loincloths and headbands, as well as wearing moccasins. And the women were dressed in dresses that went down to around the knee. But I also beheld people who were carrying baskets of rocks, who were working on what looked to me to be very poorly thriving crops, and they were bringing some of these crops in baskets with them. But these people were very thin, dressed very poorly, and indeed, some of the men were naked. The women who were laboring looked extremely worn, and their clothes were ragged. A light scan told me that these people weren't necessarily of the Anasazi. They were from other tribes and had been taken as slaves. And in fact, the Anasazi were slavers. They traded pottery. I could definitely hear that. And it was very beautiful pottery. But they also traded humans. And they were slavers. They took them in raids. And they used these people to do a lot of the hard work. And they'd have them sometimes under guard traveling hundreds of miles to collect rock and other things and to do trading. And they abused them quite severely, which did not expose me to these Anasazi civilization, or the civilization, in a very positive way. I became very upset by what I was seeing. I didn't know that these people were slavers, and I was obviously horrified by the situation. And things will get worse, and I'll warn you before they do. So I started doing more light scans. When I don't have permission, I'll only do a light scan. And by that, I mean just surface thoughts that are very strong and that are leaking out, quite frankly, all over the place. The average human is not very disciplined, and their thoughts leak out and their emotions leak out all over the place. So they're very easy to pick up. And since I'm not doing a deep scan, it's not really what I would consider invasive. It's just, I know from my standpoint, these people are long dead, but they look very much alive in my experience. And so that's kind of my imperative, my moral imperative, not to do deep scans. And the suffering people, which I started with worse, I could feel their pain and suffering, and how they were worked to death, and that they were starving, and they were being fed even less than they were normally being fed because there was a food shortage. The crops were failing because the winter snows had lessened or disappeared. The rains had stopped, and very little was coming. And they had never irrigated their crops because there had always been enough rain to grow a number of crops, at least in limited growing seasons, and from the melt from the snow. But now things are extreme. Although the Anasazi, the ruling class, if you will, looked to me to still be pretty decently healthy. But things, as I said, were definitely going to get darker soon. I decided to progress to a little bit later, and now it was night. And the people had gathered in large numbers around what is termed a kiva. It was a holy site, you might say, for these Anasazi. And it was approximately, I'd say, about 15 feet, or what is that, about 4.5 meters or so, in circumference. And it was below ground with stone walls lining the walls of this depressed area. And it had a wooden roof over it. And I saw that there were a number of people, several of which were naked, and they were surrounded by armed warriors who definitely looked a lot better than they did. I mean, they were, the ones that were naked were emaciated and on the verge of death. They were, it was some sort of ceremony. In my scan, I sensed darkness. I sensed a vision of a horned serpent. And the thoughts that came to me were of the Aztec. And I was wondering, is it possible that some of those religious beliefs and rituals from the Aztec had made it that far north to the Anasazi Civilization? And what I saw definitely put me on my guard, because the naked person was shoved into this below ground kiva or temple, and he was followed or surrounded by, there was already a priest in there, and then there was two warriors which had escorted this naked man into this underground kiva. I went into the kiva, going through the walls, because I thought I wanted to see what was going to happen. Now's about the time for anybody with very sensitive stomach to maybe skip the next couple minutes, because it gets intense and horrific. I was inside, and there was a fire, and there was a very large flat stone that perhaps was an altar of sorts. And there was writing on it. There were some totems on it. But the priest, let's call him a priest, I don't know what else to call him, said some words. I couldn't really decipher them, and I couldn't even get a sense for an English equivalent. Typically, it can be hard with certain rituals that don't have an equivalent in my experience, because I can't translate them. But I know it was an appeal to some sort of dark being or God for relief from the lack of rains, the lack of game which has fled. That's about as much as I got, and I know there was a lot more that I probably missed. When he was done speaking, the two men, as if on command, grabbed this poorly struggling man. You could tell he'd given up all hope. He struggled a little, but not much. Besides, what could he do? He was weak, obviously so, starved, and the two men holding on to him were well-muscled and strong. Lean, but well-muscled. They forced this naked man's head onto this, the side of his head, onto this large flat rock. Now, I half expected the priest to pull out a knife and, maybe try to cut out this guy's heart like the Aztecs used to, but no, that's not what happened. Instead, the priest bent over and picked up a very large, roundish-looking rock, and I wondered for a second, the fool that I am, what he was going to do with that, and I found out all too quickly. He took the rock and slammed it down with all of his might onto this poor individual's head, cracking the skull open, and I could see brain and bone splinters. He was then removed from this kiva, or temple, and there's no better word for it. I can't sugarcoat it. He was butchered like you would butcher an animal. And I saw the flesh being thrown into boiling pots for cooking. I saw the bones, after the flesh was stripped, being thrown into a fire so that they could cook, and then they were taken out after somewhere around 15 or 20 minutes, I estimate. It's hard to estimate time like that when you're in the astral. But I then saw people cracking the bones open and sucking the marrow out. Okay, it was revolting, loathsome. And if I'd had a physical stomach, I probably would have emptied the contents of it. So, after that experience, I returned to my body. Whenever you feel strong emotions, the return to the body is inevitable. Whether those emotions are positive or negative, it's part of your defense system. And normally I'm able to control my emotions, but I think you could give me a break and understand that after what I'd seen in this revolting sacrifice, that my emotions got away with me. So when I returned to my body, luckily I had an empty stomach because I rushed to the bathroom and thought I was going to vomit. Luckily, I didn't, but I certainly was affected by this experience and still am 48 hours or so later. So that was my experience, going to see the end of this ancient Pueblo civilization, Anasazi, call them whatever you like. I don't know what they were like before the hard times hit, but they weren't perfect people. They had noble pursuits, astronomy, excellent pottery makers, but they also descended into great darkness. And I don't know that the archaeologists of today necessarily understand just how deep that darkness went, from slavery to human sacrifice to cannibalism. Anyway, that was the experience. If you profited, I don't like to use the word enjoyed in this case, but if it was interesting to you, please hit the like button. Share it with those of like minds. Subscribe if you haven't already, and over 80% of you have subscribed, which is an unbelievably large figure. If you haven't, hit the bell. Make sure that that's on, and that you get informed of the Wednesday afternoon and Saturday morning episodes. And as always, I'm open to your questions and comments. I could have talked a lot more about what I saw, but I'm trying to keep these things down to 20 minutes or so whenever possible, so people will actually listen to it instead of blowing it off. At any rate, this is Rick, and I hope to see you on the astral plane.